The radio crackled to life as I pulled out of the station parking lot, Mike's voice cutting through the static. Unit 7, we've got your usual pickup on Route 28. Same protocols apply. I keyed the mic. Copy that, dispatch. Same protocols. Right. As if anyone had ever bothered explaining what those protocols actually meant. 5 years I'd been working these night shifts in the Catskills, and 5 years I'd been following rules that made no sense to anyone with half a brain. See the tall man in the long coat? Drive him to Miller Road and let him out at the stop sign. Don't talk to him. Don't ask questions. File the transport report under routine patrol assistance and move on with your life. The thing was, I'd gotten good at not asking questions. Maybe too good. I rolled down the windows as I took the winding mountain road toward Route 28. October air rushed in, carrying the smell of dying leaves and something else, something sharp and electric that made the hair on my arms stand up. The radio played soft jazz, which helped keep me calm during these weird-ass transports, but tonight even Miles Davis couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The headlights swept across the familiar bend where Route 28 intersected with the old fire road. And there he was, just like always. Tall figure in a long, dark coat, standing maybe 10 feet off the shoulder like he'd been waiting there all night. Like he'd been waiting there all his life. But tonight was different. I could tell the moment I saw him. He looked more solid. Usually the guy seemed like he might blow away in a strong wind, all blurred edges and uncertain outline. Tonight he stood rooted to the spot like he owned that patch of asphalt. I pulled over and put the car in park, leaving the engine running. The routine was simple. He'd get in the back seat, I'd drive him to Miller Road, he'd get out at the stop sign, and I'd never see him again until the next time dispatch sent me on this same idiotic errand. The back door opened with a soft click. I didn't turn around. Rule number 1, don't look directly at him. I'd learned that one the hard way during my second month on the job, when I'd made the mistake of checking the rearview mirror. Seeing that smooth, blank space where his face should have been had given me nightmares for a week. Miller Road? I asked, putting the car in drive. Silence. Same as always. I pulled back onto Route 28, taking the curves nice and easy. No point rushing through this weirdness. The guy never seemed to be in any hurry. And honestly, the sooner I got him where he was going, the sooner I could stop thinking about the fact that I was chauffeuring someone who shouldn't exist according to any rational understanding of the world. But tonight, as we wound through the dark forest, something changed. The children aren't where you think they are. I nearly drove into a tree. In 5 years of doing these transports, the guy had never said a single word, not one. I'd started to wonder if he even could talk, or if he was just some kind of walking, natural phenomenon that happened to need rides to Miller Road every few weeks. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. What did you say? Nothing. Back to the usual silence. I checked the rearview mirror without thinking, then immediately wished I hadn't. Same blank space where a face should be. Same impossible smoothness that made my brain want to shut down rather than process what it was seeing. But he'd definitely spoken. I wasn't losing my mind. What children? I asked. Still nothing. We reached Miller Road in another 2 minutes, and I pulled up to the stop sign like I had dozens of times before. The door opened, and I felt rather than saw him getting out. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, watching the empty road stretch into darkness. The door closed with that same soft click. I waited 30 seconds, then looked in the rearview mirror, gone, as always, like he'd never been there at all. Except tonight, he'd left something behind. I twisted around to look at the back seat and felt my stomach drop. There, carved deep into the black leather, was a symbol I'd never seen before. Not carved exactly, more like burned. The leather around it was still warm. It looked almost like a tree, but wrong. The branches twisted in directions that hurt to follow, and the roots seemed to spiral down into something that definitely wasn't soil. Just looking at it made my head ache. I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. "Go ahead, 7. "I just dropped off our passenger, but we've got some property damage to the vehicle. Someone carved something into the back seat." A pause. Longer than usual. "Copy that, 7. What's the nature of the damage?" "Looks like a symbol of some kind. Pretty deep cut into the leather." Another pause. "Unit 7. Please confirm you followed standard protocols during transport." Standard protocols. There was that phrase again, like it actually meant something. "Affirmative, dispatch. No deviation from routine." "Copy. File your report and continue patrol. Maintenance will assess the damage tomorrow." I stared at the radio. That was it? No questions about how someone had managed to carve a symbol into my back seat while I was driving? No concern about potential vandalism to department property? "Dispatch, should I bring the vehicle in for inspection?" "Negative, 7. Continue your patrol route." "And 7. "Yeah. Stick to the protocols. Don't overthink things." The radio went quiet. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, staring at that twisted symbol in my rearview mirror. Don't overthink things. Right. Because thinking was apparently discouraged in this job. I pulled away from the stop sign and headed toward town, trying to shake the feeling that everything I thought I understood about these weird transports had just changed. The guy had never talked before. He'd never left any trace of his presence. And Mike's response felt way too rehearsed, like he'd been expecting this call. The radio crackled again. "Unit 7, we've got a report of suspicious activity near the Mountain View Diner. Can you swing by and check it out?" On my way. At least, that sounded like normal police work. Maybe a cup of coffee and some human interaction would help me make sense of what had just happened. The Mountain View Diner sat at the intersection of two mountain roads like a glowing island in the middle of nowhere. Fern O'Sullivan ran the night shift there, and she made the best coffee in 3 counties. More importantly, she was the kind of person who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about why a small-town cop looked like he'd seen a ghost. I pushed through the front door, and the little bell above it chimed a welcome. Fern looked up from wiping down the counter, her red hair catching the fluorescent light. "Well, if it isn't our local night owl," she said. "You look like you could use some caffeine." "You read minds now, Fern?" "Honey, I've been working nights for 15 years. I can read exhaustion from across a parking lot." She poured coffee into a heavy white mug without being asked. "Ham and Swiss? You know me too well." She started assembling a sandwich, her movements quick and efficient. "So what brings you by? Please tell me it's not another one of those weird transport calls." I nearly choked on my coffee. "What do you know about transport calls?" "Relax, Officer Fletcher. I just notice patterns. Every few weeks you come in here looking like you've seen something that doesn't make sense, order coffee and a sandwich, and spend 20 minutes staring out the window like you're trying to figure out how the world works." She slid the sandwich across the counter. "Tonight you look worse than usual." I took a bite, buying time to think. Civilians weren't supposed to know about the supernatural protocols. Hell, I wasn't even sure I knew about them. But Fern had always been observant, and she'd lived in these mountains her whole life. "Just routine patrol," I said finally. "Uh-huh." She leaned against the counter. "You know, I've been seeing some strange lights in the woods behind my place. Last 3 nights running. Not like car headlights or anything normal. More like, I don't know. Like someone was carrying around pieces of the aurora borealis." My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. Strange lights? Probably nothing. But with all these missing kids reports lately, she shrugged. Makes a person nervous, you know? Are you guys investigating anything unusual? The missing kids. Right. We'd had 5 reports in the past month, though they'd all turned out to be false alarms. Kids found safe within a few hours, no sign of foul play. Mike had classified them as routine runaways, but something about the pattern had been bugging me. Nothing to worry about, I heard myself saying. Probably just teenagers with flashlights. Probably. But she didn't look convinced. I finished my sandwich and left money on the counter. Thanks for the coffee, Fern. And if you see those lights again, give us a call. Will do. Drive safe out there. I walked back to my patrol car, thinking about strange lights and missing children and faceless men who suddenly decided to start talking. None of it fit together, but the pieces felt important in a way I couldn't explain. I opened the driver's door and froze. The symbol carved into the back seat was glowing. Not bright, just a faint, sickly light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. As I watched, the glow faded until it was just a carved mark in leather again. I grabbed my radio with shaking hands. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Go ahead, 7. I need to come in. There's something wrong with the patrol car. Define wrong, 7. I stared at the symbol, trying to figure out how to explain what I'd just seen without sounding insane. Equipment malfunction. I think there might be an electrical issue. A long pause. When Mike's voice came back, it sounded careful, measured. Unit 7, you're scheduled to complete your patrol route. Bring the vehicle in at end of shift for maintenance review. Mike, I really think end of shift, 7. That's an order. The radio went dead. I stood there in the diner parking lot, looking at my patrol car and trying to understand why my boss seemed more interested in keeping me on the road than investigating potential equipment problems. 5 years I'd been following protocols I didn't understand, driving around passengers who shouldn't exist, and filing reports that disappeared into some filing cabinet I'd never seen. Tonight, for the first time, I was starting to wonder who those protocols were really designed to protect. And more importantly, what they were protecting us from. I got back in the car, avoiding another look at the back seat, and pulled onto the mountain road. 3 more hours until end of shift. 3 more hours of pretending everything was normal while that carved symbol sat behind me, like a question I wasn't allowed to ask. The children aren't where you think they are. What the hell did that mean? And why did I have the sinking feeling I was about to find out? The radio crackled back to life just as I was turning onto Maple Street, Mike's voice cutting through my thoughts about glowing symbols and cryptic warnings. Unit 7, we have a missing child report on Pine Creek Road. Emma Brooks, age 8, last seen in her backyard approximately 2 hours ago. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. 2 hours ago was right around the time I'd been dropping off my faceless passenger. Copy that, dispatch, en route to Pine Creek Road. Family's pretty shaken up, Mike continued. Mother's name is Adeline Brooks. Handle this one carefully, 7. Something in his tone made my skin crawl, the same measured quality I'd heard when he'd insisted I finish my patrol route despite the obvious equipment malfunction sitting behind me. Pine Creek Road wound through one of the older residential areas where houses sat on larger lots backed up against state forest land. The Brooks place was a modest 2-story colonial with yellow crime scene tape already fluttering around the backyard. I pulled into the driveway behind another patrol car and saw Officer Martinez standing on the front porch talking to a blonde woman in her 30s. The woman looked up as I approached, and I could see the kind of bone-deep terror that every parent fears, but underneath it, something else, something that looked almost like recognition. Mrs. Brooks, I'm Officer Fletcher. I understand your daughter is missing. Emma, she said, her voice thick with barely controlled panic. She was playing in the backyard while I made dinner. I called her in and she didn't answer, so I went to check. She gestured helplessly toward the back of the house. She never leaves the yard. Never. She knows the rules. The rules. There was that phrase again. Martinez filled me in on the basics while Adeline wrung her hands. 8-year-old Emma Brooks, last seen around 9 p.m. playing near the tree line behind the house. No signs of forced entry, no disturbance in the yard, no indication she'd been taken by anyone. Just gone. Have you checked the surrounding woods? I asked Martinez. Initial sweep, yeah. Nothing obvious. But it's pretty dense back there, and we're losing light. I nodded and turned to Adeline. Mrs. Brooks, has Emma ever wandered off before? Even just to a neighbor's house? Never. The word came out sharp and definitive. She's very good about boundaries. Almost too good sometimes. Other kids her age, they push limits, but Emma... She trailed off, biting her lip. But Emma what? She's always been different. More aware, I guess. Like she understands things other children don't. Adeline's eyes met mine, and I saw something that made my stomach clench. She's been having dreams lately. About stairs in the forest. About someone who wants to show her things. The carved symbol behind me seemed to pulse with heat. What kind of dreams? She said there was a nice man who promised to show her where the real world begins. But he didn't have a face. Adeline's voice dropped to a whisper. I know how that sounds, but I've heard stories from other parents about rules we're supposed to follow to keep our children safe. Martinez looked confused, but I felt something click into place in my head. The same uncomfortable recognition I'd been fighting all night. I'd like to take a look at the backyard, I said. The Brooks property stretched back maybe 50 yards before hitting the tree line. Normal suburban yard, swing set, sandbox. The kind of place where an 8-year-old should be perfectly safe. But as I walked toward the woods, that electric feeling I'd noticed earlier came back stronger than ever. She was playing right here, Adeline said, pointing to a spot near the trees, with her dolls. When I called for dinner and she didn't answer, I found the dolls still arranged in a circle, but what? They were facing the woods, all of them, like they were watching something. I knelt down where she was pointing and felt the hair on my arms stand up. The grass was pressed down in a perfect circle, and at the center, barely visible in the fading light, someone had scratched a symbol into the dirt. The same twisted tree design that was carved into my back seat. Mrs. Brooks, I need you to go back to the house. But, please, just for a few minutes. She hesitated, then nodded and walked back toward the porch. I waited until she was out of earshot, then pulled out my flashlight and stepped into the woods. The trees closed around me like a living tunnel, branches reaching across the path in ways that seemed deliberately tangled. But I knew where I was going. My feet found the route without conscious thought, following some internal compass that definitely hadn't been part of my police training. I found the staircase maybe 30 yards into the forest. But this one was different. Instead of the narrow wooden steps I'd encountered on previous calls, this staircase was wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side. The wood looked older, darker, and every third step was carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The purple light filtering down from above was brighter, more violent, and the air around the staircase shimmered like heat waves. The children aren't where you think they are. I keyed my radio. Unit 7 to dispatch. Go ahead, 7. I found something in the woods behind the Brooks residence. I'm going to need backup. A pause. What kind of something, 7? I stared up at the impossible staircase, thinking about protocols and missing children and faceless men who suddenly decided to start talking. I found where Emma went. Copy that. Stay put until backup arrives. But even as I said, Roger, I was already climbing the first step. The otherworld forest was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The purple-tinted trees leaned at angles that made my eyes water, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse like a slow heartbeat. The path ahead wound between twisted trunks that looked almost like they were trying to form letters or symbols. I found Emma at the center of a clearing, maybe 50 yards from the top of the stairs. She was unconscious, lying in another perfect circle, but this one was made of stones that glowed with the same sickly light I'd seen in my patrol car. Symbols covered her arms and face, not carved like in my back seat, but painted in something that shifted color as I watched. The marks pulsed in rhythm with her breathing, faint but definitely there. Emma? I knelt beside her, checking for injuries. She seemed physically unharmed, just deeply asleep. "Emma, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and strange. When she spoke, her voice sounded older than 8 years old. "He said you'd come. The nice man with no face. He said the police officer who remembers the old ways would find me." "What nice man, Emma? Where is he now?" "He had to go away when you got close. But he'll be back." She sat up slowly, the glowing symbols on her skin beginning to fade. "He showed me things about my family, about why I can see things other people can't." I helped her to her feet, my mind racing. "What kind of things?" "Secret things. About the people who came before, and the promises they made, and why some children are special." She looked up at me with eyes that seemed far too knowing. "He said you're special too, but you forgot. He said that's why your family had to go away." My family. I had fractured memories of leaving town when I was 12, my parents saying we needed a fresh start somewhere else, but I'd never understood why, and they'd never explained. "We need to get you home, Emma." She nodded and took my hand, but as we walked back toward the staircase, she kept talking. "The nice man said things are changing, that the old rules don't work anymore. He said soon all the special children would have to choose which world they want to live in." The staircase came into view, but it was already starting to shimmer and fade around the edges. "Emma, we need to hurry." We took the steps 2 at a time, the other world forest dissolving behind us like fog. By the time we reached the bottom, the staircase was gone completely, leaving only normal woods and the distant glow of the Brooks house. Adeline was waiting on the back porch, and her relief when she saw Emma was so intense it felt like a physical force. But underneath it, I caught something else. Something that looked like resignation. "Oh, baby," she said, pulling Emma into a fierce hug. "I was so scared." "I'm okay, Mom. The nice man took care of me." Adeline's eyes met mine over Emma's head, and I saw knowledge there. Not surprise, not confusion, but the kind of tired understanding that comes from carrying a secret too long. "We should get Emma checked out by a doctor," I said, "just to be safe." "That won't be necessary," Adeline said quickly. "She looks fine, just tired. Aren't you tired, sweetheart?" Emma nodded and yawned, the symbols on her skin now completely faded. "Can I go to bed?" "Of course. Go get ready and I'll be up in a minute." Emma disappeared into the house, leaving Adeline and me standing in the backyard where dolls had been arranged to face the woods, and symbols had been scratched into the dirt. "Mrs. Brooks," I said carefully, "Emma mentioned seeing someone in the forest, someone without a face." "Children have such vivid imaginations," she said, but her voice was strained. "Thank you so much for finding her, Officer Fletcher. I can't tell you how grateful I am." She was already moving toward the house, clearly ending the conversation. But as she reached the door, she turned back. "Officer Fletcher? Emma's father used to work for the police department before he left town. He used to say that some officers understood things others didn't, that there were old ways of keeping people safe." Her grip tightened on the door handle. "I think he would have been glad it was you who found her." Then she was gone, leaving me alone in the backyard with more questions than answers. I walked back to my patrol car, thinking about Emma's words. The police officer who remembers the old ways, my family going away, special children and changing rules and choices between worlds. In the rearview mirror, the symbol carved into my back seat looked different somehow. Not just a random mark, but part of something larger, a piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. The radio crackled. "Unit 7, what's your status?" "Child located and returned safely to family. No signs of foul play." "Copy that. Any indication of where she'd been?" I looked back at the woods where an impossible staircase had led to an otherworld forest full of glowing stones and painted symbols. Just wandered off into the trees. Got turned around in the dark. Roger, file your report and return to patrol. But as I pulled out of the Brooks driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that filing a normal missing child report wasn't going to cut it this time. Emma had been marked, chosen for something I didn't understand, and whoever had taken her knew exactly who I was. The nice man with no face was planning something, and somehow I was part of it. The question was whether I was supposed to stop him or help him, and I had the sinking feeling that figuring out the answer was going to require remembering things my mind had been working very hard to forget. I walked into the station the next morning with Emma's words still echoing in my head. The police officer who remembers the old ways. My coffee tasted like ash, and the carved symbol in my patrol car seemed to throb every time I glanced in the rearview mirror. The bullpen was mostly empty. Day shift didn't officially start for another hour, but I needed to look at something while my head was still clear. 5 missing children in the past month. All found safe. All classified as routine supernatural encounters. All bullshit. I pulled the files from the cabinet Mike kept locked, using the master key I wasn't supposed to have. Tyler Morrison, age 9. Sophia Chen, age 7. Marcus Williams, age 10. Lucy Hartwell, age 8. And now Emma Brooks, though her case wouldn't be filed until tomorrow. The reports read like carbon copies. Child reported missing from backyard. Officer responds, finds evidence of otherworld access point. Child located in forest dimension, unharmed but disoriented. No memory of incident. Case closed. But the details were wrong. Different officers had written the reports. Martinez, Patterson, even Mike himself on one of them. Yet the handwriting looked identical under close examination. Same phrases, same clinical descriptions, same careful omissions about what the children had actually experienced. I spread the files across my desk and felt that familiar electric sensation crawling up my spine. Each child had been found in the exact same location, the twisted forest with purple-tinted trees. Each had been marked with symbols that faded quickly upon return to normal dimension. Each had spoken about a helpful figure who wanted to show them important things. The door chimed, and I looked up to see Fern O'Sullivan walking toward my desk. She looked like she hadn't slept, her red hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and dark circles under her eyes. "Officer Fletcher, I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I need to talk to someone about my daughter." I quickly closed the files, but not before she caught a glimpse of the paperwork. Her face went pale. "How many?" she asked quietly. "How many what?" "Children. How many children have gone missing?" I hesitated, then gestured to the chair beside my desk. 5, including Emma. "Why?" Fern sat down heavily, clutching a manila folder against her chest like armor. "Because my daughter started having the dreams 3 nights ago. The same night I saw those lights in the woods. She keeps talking about a nice man with no face who wants to show her where the real world begins. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. What kind of dreams? She draws pictures afterward, staircases leading up into purple trees, circles made of glowing stones, and always this figure standing at the edge, reaching out his hand." Fern's voice cracked. She says he tells her she's special, that her family has important work to do. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, children have vivid imaginations. My husband used to be a police officer here." The words came out sharp and definitive. 20 years ago, before we moved away. Before he died in what the department called an equipment malfunction. Everything went very still. "He left behind notes," she continued, opening the folder with shaking hands, "about the supernatural protocols, about rules that kept certain entities contained, about what happens when those rules get broken." She pulled out a thick stack of handwritten pages covered in diagrams and careful observations. Police report forms modified with additional notes in the margins. maps of the forest with X's marking specific locations, and at the top of the first page, written in fading blue ink, Guardian Protocols, Officer Sean O'Sullivan, 2003. He wrote about entities that pose as helpful guides, Fern said, flipping through the pages, things that test children to see if they carry certain bloodlines. He said the department had procedures for handling them, but that some officers didn't understand what they were really protecting. I stared at the notes, recognizing some of the terminology from my own mysterious protocols. But where my instructions had been vague and incomplete, Sean O'Sullivan's notes were detailed and specific. The faceless entities aren't dangerous as long as they follow the rules, I read aloud from one of his entries. But they're scouts, testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses in the barriers that keep worse things from breaking through. He died trying to investigate something in the woods behind Miller Road, Fern said. The same road where you drop off your passenger every few weeks. The room seemed to tilt sideways. How did you know about... Because my husband used to do the same transports, until he started asking questions about why the entities were getting stronger, why they were paying more attention to specific children. Heavy footsteps approached from behind me. I turned to see Mike walking toward us, his face set in an expression I'd never seen before. Not the usual departmental concern, but something colder, more calculating. Mrs. O'Sullivan, he said, his voice carrying an edge that made my skin crawl. I thought I made it clear 20 years ago that civilian interference in police matters wasn't welcome. Fern's hand tightened on her husband's notes. My daughter is having nightmares about the same thing that killed Sean. I think that counts as police business. Children have bad dreams. It's normal. Mike stepped closer, looming over the desk. What's not normal is citizens spreading unfounded rumors about departmental procedures. They're not rumors if they're documented in official police reports, I said, gesturing to the files I'd been reviewing. Mike's eyes flicked to the papers, then back to my face. Those files are classified, Officer Fletcher. You don't have authorization to review them. I'm the one who wrote half these reports. I think I have authorization to understand what I'm documenting. You have authorization to follow protocols, not to question them. He turned back to Fern. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is police business. This is my daughter's safety. Your daughter will be perfectly safe as long as you don't interfere with procedures designed to protect this community. Mike's tone carried a threat that made the hair on my arms stand up, just like your husband would have been safe if he'd stuck to his assigned duties. The words hung in the air like smoke. Fern went very still, and I felt something fundamental shift in the room. Are you saying my husband's death wasn't an accident? She asked quietly. Mike realized he'd said too much, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. I'm saying that officers who follow procedures tend to have longer, healthier careers than officers who don't. That was it. That was the line being crossed in broad daylight. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket, I think we should continue this conversation somewhere else. Somewhere with better coffee. Mike stepped between us and the door. Officer Fletcher, you're scheduled for desk duty today. You'll be staying here. Actually, I'm off duty as of 10 minutes ago. I checked my watch. Shift ended at 8. I'm officially a civilian having coffee with another civilian. Don't push this, Zeke. The use of my first name felt like another threat. But looking at Fern's pale face and the folder full of her dead husband's research, I realized I was already in deeper than protocols could protect me from. See you tonight, Chief, assuming you still want me handling those transport calls. I walked past him toward the door, and after a moment, Fern followed. Mike didn't try to stop us physically, but I could feel his eyes boring into my back like laser sights. In the parking lot, Fern was shaking. He killed Sean. I know it. All these years I thought it was an accident. But the way he just talked... We need to find somewhere safe to look through those notes, I said. somewhere he can't follow. Where? I thought about John Copeland, sitting by his wife's grave every afternoon like clockwork. The grieving widower who always seemed to know more about the town's rhythms than any normal resident should. The old cemetery on Hillcrest Road, there's someone there who might have answers. We drove separately, and I spent the 15-minute trip trying to process what had just happened. Mike's hostility had been too immediate, too specific, like he'd been waiting for this conversation to happen, like he'd been preparing for it. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the valley, old enough that some of the headstones had worn smooth and illegible. I found John exactly where I expected him to be, sitting on the bench beside a modest grave marker. But today, something was different. He wasn't staring at the headstone with that vacant grief I'd seen dozens of times before. Instead, he was watching the road, like he'd been expecting us. "Officer Fletcher," he said as we approached, "and Mrs. O'Sullivan. I was wondering when you'd figure out you needed to talk to me." Fern stopped walking. "How do you know my name?" "I knew your husband." John stood up from the bench, and suddenly he seemed taller, more solid, more present. Sean was a good man. He understood what he was protecting, even when the cost became too high. "You're not really a grieving widower, are you?" I asked. John smiled, and it completely transformed his face. "There is no Mrs. Copeland. Never was. The grave marker is real enough, but it's not marking a burial site." He gestured to the ground beneath our feet. "It's marking a seal, something that's been keeping worse things than faceless men from breaking through to our world." "How long have you been guarding it?" Fern asked. "Since 1897, give or take a few years." I stared at him. "That's impossible." "Officer Fletcher, in the past 24 hours, you've transported a faceless entity, found a child in an otherworld forest, and discovered that your boss is threatening civilians who ask too many questions about supernatural protocols." John's expression became serious. "How much of your definition of impossible are you willing to renegotiate?" Fern opened her husband's folder again. Sean wrote about guardians, people who maintained the barriers between worlds. He thought there was one in every generation, but he never found out who it was. "The guardian tradition is older than the police department," John said. "But when formal law enforcement came to the mountains, we adapted, incorporated our protections into official procedures. Your husband was one of the officers who helped bridge that gap." "And Mike?" I asked. John's face darkened. "Mike learned about the guardian systems 20 years ago, but instead of seeing them as protection, he saw them as leverage. An opportunity to gain power over forces most people can't even perceive." "The children," Fern said, "the ones who've been going missing. What does he want with them?" "The same thing the faceless entity wants. The guardian bloodlines aren't random, Mrs. O'Sullivan. They run in families, and every generation, certain children carry the potential to either strengthen the barriers or shatter them completely." I thought about Emma's words, about my own suppressed memories of leaving town as a child, about the way the supernatural protocols had always felt familiar, even when they made no logical sense. "The entity is testing them," I said slowly, "seeing if they have the power it needs. And Mike is helping it identify the strongest candidates." John's voice carried the weight of genuine sorrow. "He believes that breaking the seal will give him control over the supernatural realm. What he doesn't understand is that the things waiting on the other side aren't interested in partnerships." Fern clutched her husband's notes. "My daughter. She's one of them, isn't she? One of the bloodline children." "Yes," John said gently. "And so was Emma Brooks. And so are all 5 children who've been marked in the past month." "Marked for what?" John looked at the grave marker that wasn't really a grave, then back at us. "For the ritual that will break the seal." The faceless entity needs 5 guardian bloodlines working together, their power focused through symbols that bind them to the other world. Once that connection is complete, what happens? I asked. Everything that's been kept on the other side of the barriers comes through at once. John's voice was quiet but steady. Every entity we've contained, every force we've held back, every nightmare that the guardian traditions have kept from manifesting in the real world. The afternoon sun felt suddenly cold against my skin. How do we stop it? Fern asked. John looked at me with eyes that held more than a century of watching and protecting. The guardian bloodline runs in your family too, Officer Fletcher. It's why the protocols always felt familiar, why you can navigate the otherworld forests, why the entities respond to your presence. My family left town when I was 12. They were relocated for their safety after your grandfather died trying to stop an incursion similar to what we're facing now. But your abilities were never lost, just suppressed. And now, with the barriers weakening, they're coming back, I finished. The question is whether they'll return in time to matter. John gestured toward the valley below, where I could see the lights of town beginning to flicker on as evening approached. Because tonight is the new moon, and according to the symbols the entity has been placing, tonight is when it plans to complete the ritual. Fern grabbed my arm. My daughter! If she's one of the 5, then we'd better figure out how to break a supernatural containment system that's been holding for over a century, I said, before something else breaks it first. John nodded grimly. And before Mike realizes we're no longer playing by his rules. Since 1897, John repeated, settling back onto the bench like he was preparing for a long story. Though the first few decades were trial and error, learning how to age convincingly without actually aging, creating the right kind of local history to explain my presence. The grieving widower persona worked best, gives a man reason to be solitary, to spend time in cemeteries, to know things about the town that others might not. I stared at the grave marker that wasn't really a grave. What's actually down there? The anchor point for a containment system that spans the entire valley. Think of it as... John paused, searching for the right words. Have you ever seen those old-fashioned pest traps? The kind with multiple chambers that let insects in but don't let them out? Fern nodded slowly. The supernatural entities we see around town, they're not the real threat. Exactly. They're the equivalent of houseflies. Annoying, sometimes unsettling, but ultimately harmless as long as they follow the established patterns. What we've been keeping contained are the hornets. And the children? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. John's expression grew grave. The original barrier was created by 5 families working together. The Fletchers, the O'Sullivans, the Brooks, the Morrisons, and the Chens. Each bloodline carries a piece of the total system. Individually, they can sense supernatural activity, navigate otherworld spaces, resist entity influence. Together, they can rebuild the entire containment network, Fern finished, clutching Sean's notes, or destroy it completely. Your husband understood this, John told her. He was getting close to figuring out why the entities had started paying special attention to specific children, but Mike couldn't risk him making the connection. The pieces clicked together in my head with sickening clarity. The missing children reports, they're not random encounters. Mike's been feeding information to the faceless entity, helping it identify and test the bloodline descendants. The entity poses as a helpful guide, takes them to the other world briefly, and marks them with symbols that create a connection. Not strong enough to cause immediate harm, but enough to... John gestured toward Fern's folder. Did Sean document anything about resonance patterns? Fern flipped through the pages, stopping at a hand-drawn diagram covered in technical notes. He wrote about sympathetic links, how marking multiple bloodline carriers could create a feedback loop that weakens the anchor points. 5 children, 5 bloodlines, 5 potential keys to the lock we've been maintaining for over a century. John stood up from the bench, and I could see tension radiating through his apparently elderly frame. Once the entity has marked all 5 and established the resonance pattern, it can force them to work together, I said. Even if they don't want to, even if they're unconscious. The ritual requires willing participation from the bloodlines, but willing can be manufactured through supernatural influence, especially in children who don't understand what they're agreeing to. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered Emma's words. The nice man with no face who wants to show her important things. How many of the other children had received similar invitations? My daughter, Fern whispered. The dreams she's been having. It's already starting, isn't it? The marking process, yes. But the ritual itself requires all 5 children to be present in the other world simultaneously. That's why the entity has been patient, working through established protocols, maintaining the appearance of harmless behavior. Until now, I said, thinking about the faceless man's first words to me. The children aren't where you think they are. Something's changed, John agreed. The entity is becoming more aggressive, more direct, which means... The sound of car engines cut through the afternoon air. I turned toward the cemetery entrance and saw 3 police vehicles pulling through the gates, Mike's unmarked sedan in the lead, followed by 2 patrol cars I recognized from the station. How did he find us so quickly? Fern asked. John's expression had gone from concerned to grim. Because he's been tracking you longer than you realize. The supernatural protocols aren't just about maintaining containment, they're also about surveillance. Who follows the rules, who asks questions, who might become a problem. Mike got out of his car, flanked by Officers Patterson and Martinez. But something was wrong with their movements. They walked too smoothly, too coordinated, like they were being operated by the same set of controls. Stay close to the grave marker, John said quietly, and whatever happens, don't step outside the perimeter of the headstones. Mike approached with that same calculated expression I'd seen at the station, but now it looked different. Less like administrative authority and more like predatory confidence. John, he called out, his voice carrying across the cemetery with unnatural clarity. I think we need to have a conversation about civilian interference in police operations. Chief Torino, John replied, his tone perfectly polite but somehow carrying an edge that made my skin prickle. I wasn't aware that visiting a cemetery required police supervision. It does when civilians are spreading misinformation about departmental procedures. Mike stopped about 20 feet away from us, just outside the ring of old headstones. Mrs. O'Sullivan, you're going to need to turn over your husband's files. They contain classified information. My husband's personal research isn't police property, Fern said, backing closer to the bench. Anything related to supernatural protocols is police property. Anything that could compromise ongoing operations is police property. Mike's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Anything that interferes with agreements we've made to keep this community safe is definitely police property. I felt something click into place. What kind of agreements, Mike? The kind that ensure entities like our faceless friend continue to follow rules that keep them manageable. The kind that prevent much worse things from deciding our little valley looks like an interesting place to visit. John made a sound that might have been laughter. And what did you promise in exchange for this remarkable cooperation? Access, Mike said simply. Controlled access to bloodline families, information about guardian protocols, a chance for both sides to evolve beyond the outdated containment systems that have kept this town locked in the past. You sold out the children, I said, feeling sick. You've been helping that thing identify and mark guardian bloodlines. I've been facilitating a partnership that benefits everyone involved. Mike's voice carried the same measured quality I'd heard when he dismissed equipment malfunctions and ordered me to complete patrol routes. The entity gets the information it needs to understand our world better. We get protection from the more dangerous forces that might otherwise break through on their own. And the children will play a crucial role in establishing a new kind of supernatural diplomacy, one that doesn't rely on century-old fears and outdated containment methods. Fern's grip tightened on Sean's research. That's what you told my husband, isn't it? Right before you killed him. Sean chose to see cooperation as betrayal. He couldn't understand that the old ways were failing, that we needed new approaches to supernatural management. Mike's expression didn't change, but I caught something cold moving behind his eyes. I hoped his widow would be more practical. Practical enough to hand over my daughter for your experiments? Practical enough to understand that fighting the inevitable only makes things more dangerous for everyone. John had been quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward slightly. The movement was subtle, but I felt something shift in the air around us, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure changes and your ears pop. The inevitability argument, John said conversationally. I've heard it before, usually from people who mistake convenience for wisdom. John Copeland, Mike said, and his tone carried a new kind of recognition. Or should I say, Guardian John Copeland. We've been wondering when you'd stop hiding behind your grieving widower act. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting. For what? For you to reveal enough of your true nature that removing you wouldn't look like murder. The temperature around us dropped 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. Patterson and Martinez stepped closer to Mike, moving in that same unnaturally coordinated way. And at the cemetery gates, something dark began to materialize. The faceless entity took shape slowly, like smoke condensing into solid form. But this time, there was nothing harmless about its presence. The absence where its face should be seemed to pull light into itself, and the air around it shimmered with the same purple-tinted wrongness I'd seen in the otherworld forest. I think our conversation period is over, Mike said, and his voice carried harmonics that definitely hadn't been there before. Mrs. O'Sullivan, you're going to come with us. Officer Fletcher, you're going to return to the station and resume following protocols without asking questions. And John, the faceless entity began walking toward us, its movements fluid and purposeful. John is going to explain why he thought a century of containment was preferable to productive cooperation. John raised his hand, and suddenly the air between us and them felt solid, like an invisible wall had sprung up along the line of headstones. The entity stopped walking, its non-face turning toward the barrier with what might have been curiosity. The containment wasn't to keep them out, John said calmly. It was to keep much worse things from noticing we exist. But I could see sweat beading on his forehead, and the invisible barrier flickered like a candle flame in wind. The faceless entity pressed one hand against the wall of air, and where it touched, reality seemed to bend. The barrier held for maybe 30 seconds before something fundamental shifted in my head. Like a dam breaking, except instead of water, it was memories flooding back. Not just memories, understanding. I could suddenly see the lines of power running through the cemetery, connecting each headstone to something deeper. The grave marker John had been guarding wasn't just a seal. It was the keystone in a network that stretched under the entire valley, holding back pressures that would have made the faceless entity look like a lost puppy. Jesus, I breathed, staggering as 20 years of suppressed knowledge slammed into my consciousness. My grandfather didn't die in an accident. He died fighting something that came through the old Miller Road breach. John glanced back at me, sweat now streaming down his face as he maintained the barrier. The bloodline activation is painful the first time. Try to stay focused. But focusing was impossible when I could suddenly perceive what the faceless entity actually was. Not a harmless entity following mysterious rules. A scout. An advanced probe sent by something so massive and alien that my mind couldn't quite process its full shape. It had been testing our defenses for decades, learning our patterns, identifying our weaknesses, and the 5 missing children weren't missing. They were being stored. The entity pressed harder against John's barrier, and where its hand touched the invisible wall, reality started to unravel. The air shimmered with colors that didn't have names, and I could hear something like music that made my teeth ache. "The disguise is becoming inconvenient," the entity said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The smooth, blank space where its face should be began to shift, revealing glimpses of something that definitely wasn't human underneath. "Officer Fletcher, you're beginning to remember things you were never supposed to forget." "Yeah, well, funny how nearly getting killed by supernatural predators can jog a person's memory." Mike stepped closer to the barrier, and I could see his eyes had gone completely black. "The children are safe, Zeke. They're being prepared for their new roles. No one's getting hurt." "Except for Sean O'Sullivan," Fern said, her voice carrying 20 years of grief and anger. "Except for John's wife, who never existed. Except for everyone you've been lying to." Sean chose to interfere with progress. As for the Guardian's wife, Mike's smile held nothing human. Why invent a tragic backstory when you can simply edit the existing one? John's barrier flickered again, more severely this time. The cemetery seal was designed to handle 1 or 2 entities at most. With Mike and the officers feeding it energy, "How long can you hold them?" I asked. "Long enough for you to understand what you need to do. But first, we need to strengthen the anchor point." John's voice was strained but steady. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, your husband's notes. Did he document the reinforcement ritual?" Fern flipped through Sean's papers with shaking hands. Page 47. "Emergency stabilization requires 1 guardian bloodline, 1 law enforcement authority, and 1 witness with personal connection to the supernatural community." "That's us," I said, the knowledge flowing through my awakened memories like it had always been there. "But John, if we strengthen the seal with you maintaining the barrier, I'll have to drop the protection to complete the ritual." "Yes." John's expression was calm, like he'd already made peace with what was coming. "And they'll attack the moment the barrier falls." The faceless entity had been listening, and its non-face tilted toward us with something that might have been amusement. "Even if you complete your little ritual, the children's power has already been partially integrated into our dimensional matrix. You're trying to repair a dam while we're still draining the reservoir." "Where are they?" I demanded. "Where children always go when they follow helpful strangers into the woods, the place where the real world begins." The entity gestured toward something I couldn't see. 5 staircases, 5 doorways, 5 anchor points in your reality. We've been very patient, Officer Fletcher, but patience has limits. Patterson and Martinez moved closer to Mike, their movements synchronized in a way that made my skin crawl. Behind them, the afternoon shadows were starting to stretch toward us, and within those shadows, more shapes were beginning to form. "The pocket dimension," I said, understanding flooding through me. "You're not holding the children in our world or yours. You created a space between them. Fed by their bloodline energy, accessible through the breach points your own protocols helped us maintain." The entity's voice carried satisfaction. "Your transportation duties were never about managing supernatural entities, Officer Fletcher. They were about training you to navigate between dimensions." John dropped his hand and the barrier collapsed. Everything happened at once. Mike and the corrupted officers surged forward, moving faster than humans should be able to move. The faceless entity flowed toward us like liquid shadow, and John stepped directly into their path. What followed wasn't a fight. It was something closer to controlled demolition. John moved with speed and precision that belonged to someone 1/10 his apparent age, but there were too many of them. And he was burning energy he'd spent over a century conserving. "The ritual!" he shouted, intercepting Mike's charge with movements that left after images in the air. "Start the ritual!" Fern grabbed my arm. "The grave marker. Sean wrote that you have to place your hands on the stone and speak the binding words." I dropped to my knees beside the headstone that wasn't really a headstone, pressing both palms against the worn granite. The stone was warm, pulsing with energy that felt like a massive heartbeat. "I don't know the words," I said. "They're in your blood," John called out, grappling with something that used to be Officer Martinez. "The Guardian families have been speaking them for centuries." And they were. The words came from some deep place I'd forgotten I had, flowing out in a language that sounded like wind through old trees and water over stone. The cemetery seal responded immediately, power surging through the network of underground connections. But the faceless entity had been ready for this. Instead of attacking the ritual directly, it turned toward John with predatory focus. "Guardian," it said, and the word carried weight that made the air itself seem heavy. "Your protection has lasted longer than most, but protection always ends." It moved faster than thought, covering the distance between them in a blink. John tried to dodge, but he'd been holding the barrier too long, had burned too much energy fighting the corrupted officers. The entity's hand passed through John's chest like he was made of mist. John's eyes went wide, not with pain, but with something that looked like relief. He turned toward me as his form began to blur around the edges. "The knowledge," he said, his voice already sounding distant. "Take it. All of it." And then his century of Guardian training, supernatural law enforcement techniques, and understanding of the dimensional barriers crashed into my consciousness like a freight train. I screamed, but kept my hands pressed against the seal stone as information that had taken John decades to learn burned itself into my memory in seconds. How to see through entity disguises, how to track dimensional breaches, how to bind supernatural forces to specific rules and locations, how to navigate otherworld spaces without losing your way back to reality, how to find 5 missing children in a pocket dimension that was slowly consuming their guardian heritage. John's form dispersed completely, but his voice lingered in the air. "The staircases. Find the staircases." The faceless entity turned toward me, no longer bothering to maintain even its basic humanoid shape. What stood before us now was something that belonged in nightmares, all shifting angles and impossible geometry wrapped around a hunger that could swallow worlds. "The old Guardian is gone," it said, "but you're still just beginning to understand what you've inherited." I stood up from the seal stone, feeling the power of the strengthened anchor point thrumming through the ground beneath my feet. The corrupted officers had stopped moving when John dispersed, but Mike was still standing, still wearing that predatory smile. "It's too late, Zeke," he said. "Even with the cemetery seal reinforced, we still have the children, and they're already partially integrated into our matrix." "Then I guess I'll have to go get them," I said. John's knowledge was still settling into place, but I could feel the pathways now. 5 staircases leading to 5 otherworld access points, all feeding into the central pocket dimension where the entity was holding the children. "Mrs. O'Sullivan?" I said, not taking my eyes off the entity. "Your husband's research. Did he map the breach locations?" Fern was already flipping through Sean's notes. Miller Road, Pinecrest Trail, the old fire tower, Copper Creek Bridge, and... She paused, checking the notes again. "The basement of the police station." Of course. Mike had been feeding information to the entity for years, creating access points right under our noses. "You can strengthen one seal," the entity said, its form shifting between states like it couldn't quite decide which dimension it wanted to exist in. "But you cannot be in 5 places at once, and the children's power is already anchoring our presence in your reality." But John's knowledge included more than just guardian techniques. It included a century of learning how to bend supernatural rules when direct confrontation wasn't enough. "I don't need to be in 5 places at once," I said. "I just need to get to the place where all 5 converge." I looked at the entity, feeling power I'd never known I possessed flowing through me. Thanks for the transportation tip about navigating between dimensions. I'm about to put it to good use. The nearest staircase materialized in the cemetery as I called it into existence, drawing on the amplified power of the reinforced seal. This wasn't like the tentative, unstable structures I'd encountered before. This was solid, permanent, leading directly into the heart of the pocket dimension. You don't understand what you're walking into, the entity warned. Maybe not, I said, stepping onto the first wooden step, but I'm about to find out. Behind me, I could hear Fern calling out coordinates from Sean's research, mapping the locations where the other breaches would need to be sealed. Ahead of me, the staircase rose into a sky that was the wrong color, leading toward a twisted forest where 5 children were being slowly drained of the power that kept our world safe. I climbed. The pocket dimension felt like being inside a fever dream. The trees leaned at angles that hurt to look at directly, their branches reaching toward a sun that cast purple shadows and gave no warmth. The ground beneath my feet pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, but was always just slightly off, like listening to an echo of your own pulse. And at the center of this impossible forest, in a clearing made of stones that glowed with sickly light, I found them, all 5 children, arranged in a perfect circle. Emma Brooks, Tyler Morrison, Sophia Chen, Marcus Williams, and Lucy Hartwell. They were unconscious but standing upright, their feet planted in grooves carved into the ground. Symbols covered their arms and faces, shifting and changing like living tattoos, and thin lines of light connected each child to the others, forming a web of power that pulsed with their stolen guardian heritage. The energy was being drawn up through the lines, feeding into something massive and alien that I could sense but not see clearly, something that existed primarily in the space between dimensions, using the children's power to anchor itself closer and closer to reality. I approached the circle carefully, feeling the entity's attention turn toward me like a searchlight. "Officer Fletcher," the entity's voice echoed through the twisted trees. How convenient. Now we can complete the ritual with a 6th bloodline present. "The ritual's already broken," I said, stepping into the circle. The moment my feet crossed the glowing stones, I felt the connection. The lines of power that had been draining the children's abilities suddenly included me in their network. But instead of being drained, I felt John's century of guardian knowledge flowing through the connections, disrupting the carefully balanced energy matrix. The entity's presence pressed against my consciousness, trying to force me into the same passive state as the children. But guardian training included resistance techniques that had been refined over generations. "The children belong to us now," the entity insisted, its influence pressing harder. "Their power is already integrated into our dimensional matrix." "Funny thing about guardian bloodlines," I said, placing my hands on Emma's shoulders. "We're really hard to possess once we remember what we are." I poured every ounce of John's transferred knowledge into breaking the connection between the children and the entity's feeding matrix. The symbols on their skin began to flicker and fade, and one by one, they started to wake up. Emma opened her eyes first, blinking in confusion. "Officer Fletcher? How did you get here?" "Long story. Are you okay?" She nodded, then looked around at the other children. "We were dreaming, all the same dream, about a nice man who wanted to show us important things." "Not so nice after all," I said, helping Tyler and Sophia to their feet as the binding circle continued to deteriorate. The pocket dimension shuddered around us, reality becoming unstable as the entity lost its anchor points. Trees began to dissolve at their edges, and the purple sun flickered like a dying light bulb. "You have severed our connection to the bloodlines." The entity's voice carried rage that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "But you have also destabilized the containment matrix. This dimensional space will collapse within minutes." "Great. I'd saved the children but trapped us all in a dissolving pocket reality. The staircase I'd used to enter was already beginning to fade, its wooden steps becoming translucent. But John's knowledge included emergency protocols for situations exactly like this. "Everyone hold hands," I told the children, "and whatever happens, don't let go." I reached out with senses I was still learning to use, feeling for the connections between the pocket dimension and the 5 breach points in our reality. The entity had been using those connections to drain power from our world, but now I could reverse the flow, using the children's guardian heritage to pull us back through the dimensional barriers. The forest around us collapsed inward as we fell upward, tumbling through spaces between realities while the entity's furious presence pressed against us from all sides. For a terrifying moment, I thought we wouldn't make it. The connections were too unstable. The pocket dimension was dissolving too quickly. Then suddenly we were rolling across grass that was the right color, under a sky that held a sun that gave actual warmth. The cemetery. We'd materialized right back where we'd started, the 5 children and me sprawled across the ground near John's grave marker. Fern was there immediately, helping Emma to her feet and checking her for injuries. The other children looked dazed but unharmed, their guardian abilities slowly settling back into their proper dormant state. The faceless entity was nowhere to be seen. Neither were Mike or the corrupted officers. "Are they gone?" Fern asked. I could feel the dimensional barriers settling back into place, stronger now than they'd been before. The entity's connection to our reality had been severed when I broke the children's binding circle, and without that anchor, it had been pulled back to whatever dimension it had come from. "For now," I said, helping Marcus and Lucy to stand. The pocket dimension collapse cut off its access to our world. But entities like that, they're patient. It might take years or decades, but it'll try again. "And Mike?" I looked around the cemetery, but there was no sign of the corrupted police chief or his officers. No patrol cars, no evidence they'd ever been here. I think when the entity lost its connection, anything it had been sustaining lost coherence, I said. Mike wasn't just working with it, he'd been changed by it. Without that influence, I didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to. Fern understood. The children were already starting to forget. Their memories of the otherworld experience fading into the kind of vague recollections that would seem like strange dreams by tomorrow. That was probably for the best. But I would remember everything. John's sacrifice, the entity's true nature, the weight of guardian responsibility that had now fallen to me. Standing in the cemetery where John had made his final stand, I realized my ordinary night shifts had been preparing me for this all along. Learning to follow protocols I didn't understand, transporting entities I couldn't perceive clearly, filing reports that documented supernatural activity without acknowledging what I was documenting. Now I understood the rules. More importantly, I understood why they mattered. The barriers were holding. The children were safe. And somewhere in the space between dimensions, a very angry entity was learning that guardian bloodlines don't give up easily. The grass was real. That was the first thing that registered as we rolled across the cemetery ground. Actual grass that bent under our weight instead of pulsing with otherworldly rhythm. The sun overhead gave warmth instead of casting purple shadows that moved independently of their sources. I pushed myself up on my elbows, doing a quick head count. All 5 children were sprawled around me in various states of confusion, but they were breathing, conscious, and most importantly, solid. Emma sat up first, blinking like someone waking from a deep sleep. "Where?" she started, then trailed off, her expression growing distant. The symbols that had covered her arms and face in the pocket dimension were completely gone, leaving unmarked skin that looked like it had never been touched by other worldly forces. "You're safe," I told her, getting to my feet and offering her a hand up. "You're all safe." Tyler and Sophia were already forgetting. I could see it happening in real time. the glazed look that meant their minds were filing away memories they couldn't quite process, tucking them into the category of strange dreams that fade by morning. Lucy mumbled something about having the weirdest nap ever, while Marcus just seemed confused about how he'd ended up lying in a cemetery. John's transferred knowledge let me understand what I was watching. Protective amnesia, built into the guardian bloodlines to keep children from being traumatized by supernatural encounters they weren't ready to handle. By tomorrow, they'd remember playing in their backyards and maybe having unusual dreams. Nothing more. The entity, Fern said, helping Emma dust grass off her clothes. Is it gone? I reached out with senses I was still learning to use, feeling for the dimensional barriers that protected our reality. They were stronger than they'd been in decades, reinforced by the energy backlash from the entity's banishment. The network of seals throughout the valley hummed with renewed power. Gone, I confirmed. The pocket dimension collapse severed its connection to our world. It got pulled back to whatever realm it came from. And Mike? I looked around the cemetery, but there was no sign of the police chief or his corrupted officers. No patrol cars, no evidence they'd ever been here. Where Mike had been standing when the dimensional barriers snapped back into place, there was just empty air and afternoon sunlight. When the entity lost its anchor to our reality, anything it had been sustaining. I didn't finish the sentence, but Fern understood. Mike hadn't just been working with the faceless entity. He'd been changed by it, kept functional by its influence. Without that connection, he'd simply stopped existing in any meaningful way. The weight of what that meant settled into my consciousness along with everything else John had transferred to me. I was the ranking law enforcement officer now. Not just for normal crimes, but for supernatural threats that could destroy entire communities if left unchecked. We need to get the children back to their families, I said, though part of me dreaded the explanations I'd have to give. How do you tell parents their children had been kidnapped by an interdimensional entity and held in a pocket reality for supernatural harvesting? The answer, according to John's knowledge, was simple. You don't. They wandered off into the woods during a late afternoon play session, I told Fern as we helped the children to their feet. Got turned around in the trees for a few hours before we found them. They're tired and confused, but unharmed. What about the missing children reports? Were filed by a police chief who no longer exists. As far as official records are concerned, there were no missing children. Just some kids who stayed out past dinner time and worried their parents. Fern stared at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Guardian authority includes reality editing? When necessary for protection, yes. The knowledge felt strange in my head, like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else but fit perfectly. The supernatural world has rules about maintaining separation from normal human awareness. Breaking those rules has consequences for everyone involved. We walked the children to the cemetery gates, where I called for transport to take them home. Not through official channels, those wouldn't exist anymore without Mike to coordinate them, but small towns have informal networks that work better than official procedures anyway. Mrs. Patterson from the Methodist Church happened to be driving by and offered to take Tyler and Marcus. The Chens lived close enough that Sophia could walk home with Fern's help. Lucy's grandmother was already on her way after getting a call about children being found safe near the old cemetery. That left Emma, who was looking more alert than the others, but still had that distant expression that meant her memories were settling into protected storage. My mom's going to be worried, she said as we waited for Adeline to arrive. She'll just be happy you're safe, I told her. But when Adeline's car pulled up to the cemetery gates, the expression on her face wasn't relief or even anger. It was resignation. She walked toward us with the posture of someone who'd been expecting this call for years. How bad was it? She asked me directly, barely glancing at Emma. She's fine. They all are. No lasting effects, no trauma, no memories of anything unusual. Adeline knelt in front of her daughter, studying her face with the intensity of someone checking for cracks in a precious vase. "Emma, honey, how do you feel?" "Tired," Emma said, "and confused. I remember playing in the backyard, but then I think I had a really weird dream." "That's normal, sweetheart. Sometimes when we get lost in the woods, our minds make up stories to fill in the scary parts." Adeline stood up and looked at me again. She really won't remember. The amnesia protocols are built into the bloodline genetics. By tomorrow morning, this will seem like a strange dream that fades throughout the day. "Amnesia protocols," Adeline repeated, her voice carrying 20 years of suppressed knowledge. "You're talking like someone who understands what just happened. Like someone who knows about guardian families and supernatural inheritance." Fern and I exchanged glances. Apparently, Adeline Brooks had been hiding more than just her daughter's unusual abilities. "Mrs. Brooks," I said carefully, "how much do you know about your family's history?" "Enough to know that I moved away for college hoping Emma would be born somewhere the old responsibilities couldn't find her. Enough to know that moving back here meant accepting that hope was probably pointless." She scooped Emma up despite the girl's protests that she was too old to be carried. "Enough to know that you're not the same Officer Fletcher who's been following mysterious protocols for the past 5 years." The transferred guardian knowledge confirmed what I was already suspecting. Adeline had been raised knowing about her bloodline heritage, had left town to escape it, and had returned only when circumstances made hiding impossible. "The entity is gone," I told her. "The barriers are stronger than they've been in decades. Emma's safe. For now." Adeline shifted Emma's weight, her expression softening slightly. "But this won't be the last supernatural threat, will it?" "No, there will be others. But that's what guardian families are for. That's what the protocols are for. That's what I'm for now." Adeline studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her making the same kind of calculation Fern had made earlier, deciding whether to trust the person I'd become, or keep running from responsibilities that had followed her family for generations. "Emma's too young for training," she said finally. "But when she's older, when her abilities start manifesting properly, you'll teach her what she needs to know." "We will," Fern said, stepping forward. "Guardian families work together, always have." As Adeline carried Emma toward their car, I felt the full weight of what I'd inherited settling into place. Not just supernatural law enforcement, but the responsibility for training and protecting the next generation of guardian bloodlines, making sure they understood their heritage without being consumed by it. The other children were already safely home, their families grateful, but unaware of the real danger their kids had been in. Tomorrow, Tyler would wake up thinking he'd had the strangest dream about purple trees. Sophia would remember building something with glowing stones, but wouldn't be able to recall what. Marcus and Lucy would probably forget the entire experience except for a vague sense that they'd had an adventure. Only the guardian families would remember. Only we would carry the knowledge of what had been prevented and what might come next. "So," Fern said as we watched the last car disappear down the cemetery road, "what happens now?" I looked around the cemetery, feeling the power of the restored seals humming through the ground beneath my feet. John's grave marker still sat in its place of honor, though now I understood it was marking more than just a resting place. It was commemorating a sacrifice that had protected thousands of people who would never know his name. "Now I learn how to do this job properly," I said. "Instead of following rules I don't understand, I get to understand the rules I'm following." "Sean's research includes training protocols," Fern offered. "Guardian techniques that have been passed down for generations. I could help you understand the full scope of what you've inherited." The idea of having guidance was more appealing than I wanted to admit. John's transferred knowledge was comprehensive, but it was also overwhelming. Having someone to help me sort through it, someone who understood the human cost of guardian responsibility, would make the transition much easier. "What about your daughter?" I asked. The dreams she's been having will probably stop now that the entity is gone. But if they don't, if her bloodline abilities start manifesting early, Fern shrugged. Then she'll have the best possible teacher when the time comes. We walked back toward the center of the cemetery where John's bench still sat in its place beside the grave marker. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the trees, and for the first time in months, those shadows looked perfectly normal. The supernatural entities that are left, I said, thinking about my transportation duties and the odd encounters that had defined my night shifts. They really are harmless now? As harmless as anything supernatural can be, Fern confirmed. The barriers will keep them following established patterns, maintaining the balance between worlds. You'll still have transportation duties, but now you'll understand why they're necessary. I sat down on John's bench, feeling the weight of guardian authority settling into my bones like an old injury finding its rhythm. The faceless entity was gone, but there would be others. Maybe not for years, maybe not for decades, but eventually something else would test our defenses. When that happened, I'd be ready. One more question, I said. My family. John said they were relocated for safety after my grandfather died fighting a supernatural incursion. Are they still alive? Fern sat down beside me, her expression thoughtful. Sean's notes mention a Fletcher family resettlement in the Pacific Northwest. If they're still alive, they're probably living normal lives under assumed names, trying to forget they ever carried guardian bloodlines. The idea that my parents and sister might still be out there, that they'd spent 20 years thinking I was dead, made my chest tight. But John's knowledge included the harsh realities of guardian life. Sometimes protection meant separation. Sometimes keeping people safe meant letting them believe terrible things had happened. Can I contact them? Eventually, maybe. But first, you need to master your abilities, understand your responsibilities, prove you can handle the authority you've inherited. Fern's voice was gentle but firm. Guardian reunions are complicated, Zeke. They require careful preparation. I nodded, accepting that this was another aspect of my new life that would require patience and planning. The faceless entity was gone, the children were safe, and the supernatural barriers were stronger than they'd been in generations. That was enough for now. Standing up from the bench, I looked out over the cemetery where John had made his final stand. Tomorrow, I'd return to the police station and discover that Chief Mike Torino had never existed, that I was somehow the ranking officer in a department that would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. There would be paperwork to file, explanations to give, and a whole new system of supernatural law enforcement to establish. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, I understood exactly what I was protecting and why it mattered. The town would sleep safely, unaware that their reality had been threatened by forces beyond their comprehension. Families would gather for dinner, children would complain about homework, and teenagers would sneak out to meet friends in places they thought their parents didn't know about. Normal life, made possible by abnormal people willing to stand between the worlds and hold the barriers firm. Come on, I said to Fern. Let's go get some coffee and start planning how to train the next generation of guardians. As we walked toward the cemetery gates, I felt the restored supernatural network humming with quiet power beneath our feet. The ancient compact between worlds was secure, the guardian bloodlines were protected, and somewhere in the space between dimensions, any entities planning future incursions would find our defenses much more formidable than they'd expected. My ordinary night shifts had prepared me for this responsibility all along. Now it was time to embrace what I'd been born to become.